God Hand is a game for true gamers. Spent so
God
much
Hand's
time on
glorified
it.
as
So
one of the
hands
best
go
games
so
on
much.
God Hand.
As funny as Robin Williams, and as fun as any fighting game out there. I recommend 9,000 out of 10.
To say God Hand has had an interesting history, both critically and commercially, is a massive understatement. Initially developed by Clover Studios and published by Capcom, God Hand hit store shelves in 2006 to pretty minimal fanfare. Sales figures were modest at best, with some sites even reporting initial sales were as low as 50,000 units, and most critics politely called it average before moving on with their lives. Well, except for IGN, that is, who came after the game like it had murdered the reviewer's firstborn. As a result, God Hand quickly fell into obscurity, but as time went on, the game very slowly picked up steam, with high-profile YouTube personalities, games journalists, and fans of the game upon release suddenly becoming more vocal about just how awesome this game was. Within the space of about 6 years, God Hand went from being a forgotten flop to a cult classic, known and enjoyed widely for its immense difficulty, wacky tone, and exciting hand-to-hand combat, with some fans considering it to be one of the best brawlers ever made. Which is ironic, because despite God Hand's reputation, it's a game that most people don't even seem to realize is even all that deep. While it's possible to pull off amazing stunts like this, most people seem to play God Hand like this. With over 100 usable moves and a ton of potential for creative player expression, it's shocking to see that most players seem to just mindlessly tap square until they reach the credits, and high-level play consists of players cheesing their way to the very end. There's even a literal God Hand spam bible on GameFAQs detailing how to complete the game as cheaply and effortlessly as possible. Despite its reputation as a shining example of the genre, most players, myself included, didn't make much of an effort to explore the full extent of its gameplay system until just a couple of years ago, and considering its recent surge in popularity and the dedication of action game fans to learning and mastering their games of choice, that, to me, is utterly puzzling. So today, I'd like to get to the bottom of just what keeps players from realizing there is so much more to this game than just mindless button mashing, by comparing it side by side with other efforts by Clover and Platinum Studios, and seeing just what God Hand could have done better to teach players its complex mechanics. But before we get into that, I'd like to take the time to thank Mike Cobb and Alps, two hugely influential God Hand players who practically discovered everything there is to know about this game. It wouldn't be a stretch to say these two completely changed the way God Hand could be played, and without their efforts, there's a good chance high-level God Hand play would still look a lot like this. They were very gracious in helping me put this video together. If you're interested in God Hand and action games in general, I highly recommend you check out their respective channels. So with all that out of the way, let's get this show on the road. An action game, sometimes called extreme action games, character action games, or spectacle fighters,
If you're fucking stupid.
is a unique genre. It's the type of twitchy, reflex-based challenges that arcade games and classic NES games were built out of, but with an added sense of depth in that the challenge factor is based equally on conquering external forces as it is on how well the player can operate and handle their own characters. You have to learn combos and pick up the subtle nuances of combat and control if you want to master the game, and the fun of the genre comes from grappling with a complex control scheme and memorizing a seemingly infinite combo list in order to go from beginner to pro. As frustrating as it may be to get your butt kicked by everything and everyone the first time around, the power trip a player feels when they return with a better grasp of the game's mechanics and curb stomp enemies that previously battered them to a bloody pulp is totally unmatched. The fact that an average player can clear one of these through sheer attrition, but a truly dedicated one can play masterfully within the exact same system is nothing short of remarkable. And the very best action games are the ones where interplay between the game's various mechanics can allow not just for mastery, but for stylized and expressive play. All elements that God Hand has on lock. There are so many unique elements and awesome concepts in God Hand that separate it from the average action game, both in terms of style and tone, that I can honestly say there's really nothing else like it. I mean, just look at it! What other game pits you up against demons, robots, samurai, Super Sentai midgets, and a cigar-chomping foul-mouthed Spaniard? What other game lets you dispatch enemies via nut shots, wrestling moves, and spanking? What other game lets you suplex a gorilla? Don't try to tell me that's not rad as hell. But beyond its aesthetic features, God Hand's combat is unique among action games, and that it focuses solely on hand-to-hand combat, with a protagonist who's just as immobile and clunky as the average Resident Evil character. Part of its difficulty, and arguably part of its appeal, is wrestling with a fairly limited camera system and working through fights with few maneuvering options. Instead of dancing around the battlefield at light speed, you'll be right up in the enemy's grill as you duck and weave out of the way of their attacks. Additionally, there's an almost asinine list of usable abilities, totaling in at 114 individual moves that you can customize and string together, not including the free moves that are always at the player's disposal. You can set 4 to 6 attacks up as your basic combo, from jabs and palm strikes to aerial kicks and drunken boxing moves, as well as 5 additional moves to X, triangle, and square to quickly mix up an enemy, lead into a combo, or send a foe flying. Then of course there's the titular God Hand, which offers a number of offensive or defensive strategies to use on the fly. Players can unleash its power to become invincible for 10 seconds and pummel enemies indiscriminately, or they can pull out a special roulette move to handle difficult situations. Plus, several moves have special properties, like juggling, launching, or breaking guards, which you'll have to familiarize yourself with to defeat enemies. For example, you can score a counter hit by interrupting an enemy attack with one of your own. If you use a juggle move like Charge Punch or Stomping Fist to score the counter, you'll knock the enemy into the air, which you can follow up with an air launch kick to send them flying. This is a great way to control crowds and avoid getting swarmed. If you use 2 juggle moves in a row after tripping an enemy, they'll gain extra height, allowing you to get them high enough into the air to perform an air launch kick. If you cancel a sidestep with a punch, you can sidestep twice as fast around enemies, allowing you to rapidly dodge. You can cancel out of practically every animation with a sidestep, duck, or backflip, which allows you to pull off moves with long cooldown animations in rapid succession. These are all essential to mastering God Hand, and there's a good chance you might not have known about several of those tricks, if any, on your first playthrough. That's because God Hand has a bit of a conveyance problem, which is actually something that plagues this entire genre. It's not always the fault of the developer, mind you. These concepts are so difficult to understand that it's just as easy to get lost or have trouble interpreting them, even with a proper tutorial. I can still remember when Metal Gear Rising dropped and everyone had a shit fit over the fact that there was no dodge function, only to realize that the game was actually about parrying. The difference is, players wise up to the game's mechanics in just a couple of weeks. When it takes 6 literal years and the efforts of 2 very dedicated players to really deconstruct your game's mechanics, then you know you've got a problem. So, how do you get players to better understand your mechanics without shoving text boxes down their throat? Well, there are a number of methods. The least intrusive, and thus most natural, are the ones that either teach concepts in subliminal ways through the use of hands-on tutorials and antipieces, or encourage players to practice and get better on their own, through ranking systems and New Game Plus mode. All 3 things that God Hand sadly doesn't make great use out of. God Hand was directed by legendary Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami. Mikami is an immensely talented director, and one of his greatest strengths is in his ability to teach players wordlessly. Rather than relying on tutorials or manuals, Shinji Mikami is very good at getting players to understand the basics of his games through hands-on challenges. How does he achieve this, you ask? By tossing players right into the action, of course. After all, what better way to learn than by doing? It's clear this method works, as it's been a staple of games since the very first Super Mario Bros., but unfortunately, it's not always a surefire success. Whereas simpler genres like third-person shooters or platformers can get away with leaving to players to figure out the intricacies of their games, games with deeper systems are going to have a far harder time conveying their more complex mechanics wordlessly. Now, to be fair, God Hand actually does have a number of useful antipieces in the game. In particular, the mustache doors in certain stages act as effective teaching tools on how to dodge cancel, and the big rolling ball in stage 5-7 is a unique set piece designed to teach you about giant enemy hitboxes just in time for the boss fight with Demon Elvis. But that's a total of 2 concepts vaguely explained in a game that's filled with hundreds of them that are never explained. And despite the fact that you'll eventually learn a lot of these things on your own just through playing the game, God Hand's idea of teaching through doing is having enemies kick your ass repeatedly until you can finally get by them, which unfortunately can be done through sheer luck and attrition. Early on in the game, the player comes across a duo boss called Gold and Silver, who pit you against a series of enemies that you're forced to fight 2-on-2, before finally entering the ring themselves. They attack relentlessly and can use combination attacks to gang up on you. This is meant to teach the player that fighting in crowds is difficult, and the solution is to separate them, most likely via launch moves. But if the player is smart enough to just use a dragon kick, or has enough random drops available to spam God Hand moves or restore their health, then they can just wail on the boss like normal without ever bothering to learn a thing. The problem here isn't that the players are being stubborn and refusing to learn, it's that it's all too easy to completely miss what the game is trying to teach you using tools that the game itself gives you. But that's a problem nearly every action game is gonna have. Forcing players to learn means restricting them to some degree, which ruins the expressive and freeform nature of the genre, but having a battle system this open-ended means players are always going to be able to accidentally bypass the intended lessons designed into these fights. The easiest solution to this problem I can think of are to create specialized challenge rooms that require the use of certain mechanics or abilities to succeed, preferably ones with incentivized rewards for completions. Arenas and secret missions have been a staple of action games since the very first Devil May Cry, and the idea of using them as a teaching tool is one I don't understand why more games haven't tried, especially since games like God Hand tend to have missions like these already built into them. The Fairy Challenges and Arena missions in God Hand are a set of battles that offer a simple gold prize if completed, but aside from a few arenas which let you ring enemies out, and some missions that have you use weapons or put you on a time limit, the majority of these don't require much strategy. But with some tweaking, you could easily turn these into incentivized tutorials. In Bayonetta, the Alpine Challenges are little arenas that pit you against a group of enemies, with challenge modifiers placed on top of them that force players to learn or practice certain concepts, such as using enemy weapons, only allowing players to damage foes in witch time, or limiting the amount of attacks you can use to encourage experimentation with different combos. Since they're not particularly hard to find, can be retried without penalty, and reward you with very helpful character upgrades, players will actively want to seek them out, and they might just learn a thing or two in doing so. Maybe God Hand could have a mission where enemies can only be defeated via ring outs, and the walls are just high enough that you have to use juggle and launch moves in tandem to defeat them, or pit players against an opponent who can only be stunned or damaged by counter hits. It's not a perfect solution, since again it would be 100% optional, but it gives players an opportunity to test deeper waters, as well as indicate how the game could be played on repeated playthroughs. New Game Plus is a tried and true staple of the action game genre, and one that, quite frankly, is invaluable to encouraging skill development. In fact, New Game Plus may just be the most important feature in getting new players to return to the game. Essentially, New Game Plus is a mode that allows players to start the game from the very beginning, but with all of their moves or abilities carried over to a new file. In any other game, this would lead to a hilariously unbalanced experience, but in the case of action games, it provides a valuable opportunity for experimentation. Since players no longer have to worry about survival or currency, and since they start the game decked out with all of their favorite weapons and moves, then they can afford to take greater risks, or potentially try out new things, and more of their money can be spent on advanced moves and abilities. And in some cases, New Game Plus can be played on higher difficulty settings, meaning if the player is intimidated to start on a harder mode, then they can just bring their gigantic arsenal with them as a crutch until they're ready to go in fresh. Before you know it, you're tackling the game's highest difficulty mode, using tricks and moves you never thought you'd be able to pull off, and yet again, this is an area where God Hand falls short. The essential features of New Game Plus, including carrying gold and moves over onto a new save and allowing players to try higher difficulty levels but with an expanded arsenal of moves, are sadly absent here. Instead, God Hand offers players the ability to purchase every move in the game from the get-go, as well as every power-up and roulette attack. My best guess was this was the team's attempt at stripping players of their previous moveset to encourage them to try something new, but because you're both reduced to the basic moveset and now you're strapped for gold, you're more likely to just use the money you obtain now to repurchase all the moves you found dependable on previous playthroughs. In addition, while other games make it so that all moves are at least somewhat equal to one another, God Hand has a hierarchy of moves that deal more damage and are more effective against increasingly powerful enemies. In a new game, Jab 3 would be unlocked after several stages, just in time for you to test it on a new batch of enemies with even bigger life bars, but when that move is available from the start, there's no reason not to just pick that and kick everyone's asses. An imbalance that isn't helped by the addition of more powerful god moves, which are just the basic moveset amped up to deal insane damage. This dramatically lowers a player's drive or need to experiment, especially in tandem with the game's ranking system. One of my favorite features of action games actually is the ranking system. It's a simple system, but one that not only encourages replay, but also offers insight into just what the game expects in terms of your performance. On a first playthrough, you'll likely be scraping by with whatever the game's equivalent of B's and C's are until you reach the credits. And it might be disheartening, or potentially even off-putting, to see your effort be awarded with what basically amounts to a consolation prize, but watching those bronze medals turn into platinum medals isn't just rewarding, it's a definite indicator of improvement that gives you something to aspire to. The best ranking systems are the ones that both clearly spell out what the game expects from you, and have multiple tiers or requirements with which to measure performance that add towards a cumulative total. For example, in Beautiful Joe, you're ranked by V points collected, defense, and time. You have to do well in each to get a good total, so you're encouraged to play better all around rather than focusing explicitly on one element. And since you're rewarded with more V points to buy more character upgrades and abilities, newcomers, who are more likely to need those character upgrades, are given a reason to aim for perfection, or at the very least, a good performance. This is very important, because if you have a shallow ranking system, it can accidentally encourage shallow play. Like this. The less you hold your player accountable for their performance, the more likely that player is to just do whatever the fuck they want, especially if it goes unpunished. And this is the problem God Hand's ranking system runs into. It doesn't account for damage taken, combos, or even speed and proficiency. Instead, it has two flat variables: continues used and enemies defeated multiplied by level. And since the reward for not using continues is higher altogether than the reward for enemies defeated in most cases, then challenging yourself to remain on higher levels becomes trivial when the real money is made from not dying. This is especially problematic for early players. God Hand's difficulty creates an environment in which you'll constantly be seeking upgrades to stay ahead of the curve. Thus, beginners will not have the gold to afford moves that offer more strategic value but are harder to use, meaning they'll likely stick to easier but less strategic ones. But once you find a moveset that allows you to consistently perform well, you'll be rewarded with much more gold at the end of each stage, which you probably won't even care about because you don't even want to spend more money on more moves since the ones you're using are already getting you results. There's actually a term for this principle. It's called unstable equilibrium. Games that reward skilled players with cash or more abilities are inherently unbalanced because new players who will need those abilities are going to struggle to get them, and skilled players who won't need them as much can afford them but won't care if they're already doing well with what they've got. As per usual, this is a problem in almost every action game, but most of them try to alleviate this issue by offering newcomers free abilities and upgrades to keep them from falling too far behind. Games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta give you new weapons periodically as you progress throughout the game, as well as character upgrades that you can find hidden throughout the map. And to be fair, God Hand is pretty generous about offering players some of the more unconventional moves for free, like the Yes Ma'am Kablam and Granny Smacker, as well as more strategic roulette moves like Chain Yanker and Daisy Cutter. But why would a player need to bother with the more unconventional moves when easily exploitable moves can clear a room twice as fast and earn you twice as much as any other moveset? As an experiment, I tried playing a stage conventionally, using all the things I'd learned from my previous playthroughs to play stylishly and skillfully. And then I played the entire thing just using Drunken Twist, and compared the results side by side. While one was certainly more fun and engaging, the other one yielded far better scores, meaning by the game standards, I was doing better when I was playing like a total jackass. While the ranking system might just seem like a general feature of this genre, it's an important part in the player's journey towards mastery. Clearly spelling out what you expect from the player will give them an idea of how the game should be played, and a weak ranking system that doesn't offer that insight can seriously stunt the player's growth. If God Hand had systems in place to subtract gold earned for spamming moves, or perhaps one that awarded multipliers for comboing enemies, then maybe newcomers who are looking to gain more gold will have to learn to play smarter and not cheaper. The worst part about this, though, is that it's just going to reinforce a bunch of negative habits that will likely keep the player stuck in an endless loop of mediocrity without learning a thing. More powerful moves means it's easier to button mash your way through the game, which means more golds from the game's underdeveloped ranking system, which means more apathetic play, which means less skill development and less experimentation, which ultimately leads to an undeserved reputation as just another button masher. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. The fact that God Hand managed to obtain such a dedicated cult fanbase from players who didn't necessarily mind playing the game like just another button masher probably means it's doing something right. Either due to its difficulty, its charm, or maybe even just its reputation as a forgotten gem, there's something about God Hand that's attractive to people despite its shortcomings. It certainly attracted me. I, for one, feel God Hand is perfectly fine as a button masher. Combat is snappy and fun, the difficulty is that perfect blend of hard but fair that makes getting your teeth smashed in enjoyable, and at the end of the day, that's really all that matters in a video game. But my point in making this video wasn't to shit on God Hand, or to call it a bad game, or even to caution people away from it. Quite the opposite, in fact. This video is my attempt at encouraging people not just to play God Hand, but to learn and master it. But as much as I love God Hand, I felt I needed to talk about this aspect of the game, because it ultimately provided a valuable lesson about the importance of conveyance in action games. As much as action game fans like deconstructing a game's mechanics, it's the developer's job to help us along the way. It's hard to say whether or not God Hand would have made a bigger splash upon release if it had presented itself a little bit better, but none of that matters now. God Hand is no longer a forgotten failure. It's a cult classic, and one that myself and many others would love to see followed up on in some capacity. But I'm worried that the inaccessibility of the genre is ultimately going to lead to its decline. It's hard not to feel like action game developers have been deliberately streamlining or simplifying their games recently, and it's most likely in response to the idea that these games are generally inaccessible to newcomers. And I bet we wouldn't see that so much if they made more of a conscious effort to break players into their systems. So if we want more games like God Hand, we're going to need games that do these things better than God Hand.